Hi everyone, so today we'll be looking at the challenges and solutions in post-independence Singapore, and particularly it's on the security challenges and solutions. Please take down the notes on page 30 of your contents package. Now let's go to the security challenges first. The first one is the internal and external security threats that occurred in Singapore in the 1960s. Now, firstly, there was Konfrontasi, which was a campaign of terrorism launched by Indonesia against the creation of the Federation of Malaysia. Now, you may ask, why was Indonesia against this? So, firstly, Indonesia was angry that the British was still able to retain its power over Malaysia and Singapore, and basically in Southeast Asia. Indonesia was also afraid that Malaysia was becoming a bigger threat because of the increase in Malay population. So as a result, Indonesia decided to launch around 37 bombing attacks in Malaysia and Singapore, and the most serious one was the McDonald House bombing in March 1965. And you realize that this was before separation. Now the launch of Konfrontasi was basically done to threaten the security of Singapore. Now the other security threat was the instability in Southeast Asia, namely the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War occurred between the communists in North Vietnam and the non-communists in South Vietnam. Now you know that Singapore had an early and strong fear against communism already in the 1950s. So in this time, the government was also afraid that it would not be able to stop the spread of communist influence to Singapore. So this posed a great security threat to Singapore as well. Now, if you want to find out more about Konfrontasi, you can visit this link. This is a YouTube video that summarizes the idea of Konfrontasi. Now, the other security challenge was the lack of a strong defense force in Singapore. So before independence in 1965, Singapore only had a small defense force of its own. Why? Because it depended mostly on the British and Malaysia. So this small defense force comprised 2 full-time army battalions, which made up of 1,000 soldiers, and 700 of them were Malaysians. The Navy only had 2 old gunboats, no air force, and a small police force of only 5,000 policemen. Next, there was also the British withdrawal of military forces from Singapore in 1971. So as a result, Singapore didn't have a strong defense force to replace the 26,000 British men. And this increased Singapore's vulnerability to internal and external security threats. Now imagine in the 1950s and the 1960s where riots were still occurring and there was not a very strong defense force in Singapore. That would definitely pose a risk in terms of security. Now that I've covered the security challenges, we need to think about how did Singapore solve these security problems. So as I go through the solutions, just think of the link of the solution and how did it solve the individual security problems. Now the first security solution, I believe everyone will be familiar with this, is the introduction of national service in 1967. Now what exactly is national service? So it is the compulsory enrollment of 18-year-old male citizens to the military. Before this, if you would like to join the military, it wasn't really compulsory. So what were the advantages of this? Basically, it fostered a national identity, racial integration and friendship, because all these male citizens came from different races, different backgrounds and different religions. They came together and trained to build up the military. Now this is also a solution for nation building. Next, it definitely helped to tackle the security threats as it built a defense force to overcome the problem of limited soldiers, limited resources. Now on the right, you can see a picture of the male citizens getting off the trucks in the first year of national service. We must also consider what were some other thoughts behind the introduction of national service. So this source can also be found in your textbook. It is by this guy who had to go to national service in the first year. I started working at a young age to help my family live better. I was unsure if my family could manage financially without my contribution. To be honest, I tried all sorts of ways to get out of NS. In the end, I knew I could not escape NS, so I was ready to just get on with it. But it was still a sad moment for me. In the army truck, we were still trying to fake it our misery. But as the truck moved off, it became clear to me that I was entering a new stage in my life and I needed to do something rather than be worried. So people had different perspectives towards NS. Of course, the families would be nervous and worried as their sons began to train. But other people also believed that it was necessary to tackle the security threats that were facing Singapore. Now, the second security solution was to build a defense industry. So Dr. Goh Keng Swee, then Defense Minister, decided to set up the Chartered Industries of Singapore in 1967. Now, what was the purpose of this? It was so that Singapore could produce its own weapons and military equipment with consultations with an expert. And as a result, this reduced reliance on foreign countries for military equipment and helped Singapore sustain its independence. Now on the right, you can see a poster. This is actually a poster produced in 1986 about the CIS, and you can see how the weapons have actually grown in size and also quality from 1967 all the way to the 1980s. Now the third security solution is the establishing of diplomatic relations with other countries. So previously, Singapore depended largely on the British and Malaysia to manage its foreign relations. Now, after independence, it applied for membership with ASEAN, the United Nations, and the Commonwealth. So how did this benefit them? It ensured friendly relations with many countries, and this helped to safeguard Singapore from external security threats. It also encouraged peace and stability between Singapore and other nations. By having good relations with other countries, if Singapore were to face an external security threat, the other countries may come to assist. Now the last solution is the establishing of military relations with other countries. So there was this establishment of the Five Power Defense Arrangements in 1971. What did this allow? It allowed joint military exercises between countries and allowed countries to consult each other in face of a security threat. So as a result, this improved relations with countries so that they will be of help when there is an external or internal security threat. Now in the next two slides, I will just share some additional information for you to understand the security solutions a bit better. So the Five Power Defense Arrangements, what's its relevance even up to today? Fast forward 49 years and it is still around. It is the world's second oldest military partnership in existence. And ever since 2006, it has also included terrorism and disaster relief operations. So member states have to share intelligence regarding any terrorist threats that are against both Malaysia and Singapore. On the right, you can see a picture of the defense chief and the defense ministers of the various countries. And they have just signed another year of the Five Power Defense Arrangements, and this picture was taken in 2016. So on this slide, you can see the importance of establishing diplomatic relations with other countries. And you can see some of our Singapore ministers, such as Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, S. Rajaratnam, and Dr. Goh Keng Swee. Now, in the first picture here, this is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew actually shaking the hand of North Korean leader during that time. The second picture here is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew with US President then, Richard Nixon. The third picture here is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew again with Taiwan's minister at that time. And at the bottom here is S. Rajaratnam representing Singapore at the United Nations meeting. Over here is also S. Rajaratnam shaking the hand of Indira Gandhi, which was the Prime Minister of India at that time. And the last picture here is all the Singapore leaders and ministers shaking the hand of China's leader, Deng Xiaoping. Now we have come to the end of the security challenges and solutions in post-independence Singapore, and this is a summary of how all the factors actually look like. So for the challenges, we have two: internal and external security threats. Try to recall what they were. The second one is the lack of a strong defense force. And the solutions, we have actually four: the introduction of NS, building a defense industry, establishing of diplomatic relations, and the establishing of military relations with other countries. So as you study this chapter or this part of the chapter, just ensure that you know the link of the solutions between the challenges and how it helped to solve the problems that Singapore faced in terms of security during that period. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you understand this whole chapter better.